Hello, welcome back to my channel. I am Tom Davis. I am a research associate with Probe Ministries. Today, I want to talk about the Civil War. I've been coming across people, mostly on X, that are saying that the South was right in the Civil War and that we have been sold a bill of lies, that the Civil War was not about slavery, that it was about states' rights, and that if the South had won, we would be better off today. Um, so let's look at the first root of the problem. What was the Civil War about? That's the main question I want to talk about today. And I'm going to be looking at some primary documents. And the first document I'm going to look at is a document that when I'm in discussions with these people, some of them have used this document to try and say, see, look, they were trying to keep the Union together. They didn't want states succeeding. And the whole question was about whether states had the right to succeed or not. And so this letter is by Abraham Lincoln to a man named Horace Greeley. He was a government official back at that time. And the website, if you want to read this, it's on the American Presidency Project, and it's available to the public. Anybody can go in and read this. And so here's what it says. It's sent on August 22nd, 1862. It says, Honorable Horace Greeley, Dear Sir, I have just read yours of the 19th, addressed to myself through the New York Tribune. If there be in it any statements or assumptions of fact which I may know to be erroneous, I do not now and here controvert them. If there be in it any interference which I may believe to be falsely drawn, I do not now and here argue against them. If they be perceptible in it an impatient dictatorial tone, I waive it in defense to an old friend whose heart I have always supposed to be right. So he's opening up in a friendly conversation with someone he knows, someone that Abraham Lincoln has had some conversations with before. He says, as to the policy I seem to be pursuing, as you say, I have not meant to leave out anyone in doubt. I would have the Union. I would save the Union. I would save it in the shortest way, order the Constitution. The sooner the national authority can be restored, the nearer the Union will be the Union as it was. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time save slavery, I do not agree with them. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time destroy slavery, I do not agree with them. My paramount object in this is the struggle to save the Union, and it is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would do that. I would do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps save this Union. And for what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. I shall do less whenever I shall believe what I'm doing hurts the cause, and I shall do more whenever I shall believe that doing more will help the cause. I don't really have to go any further. They will look at this and they will look at his language about if I could save the Union without ending slavery, I would do it. And if I could save the Union by freeing slavery, I would do it. So they're saying Lincoln is just trying to save the Union. But what was causing the whole problem that was putting the Union in a position where it needed to be saved? And that's really the question that they ignore. They try to, most of the time, try to step away from it when you ask them that question. So what was the whole conflict? Why did the Union needed saving? The answer is that shortly after the American War for Independence, there became a conflict between slaveholding states and free states. free states being in the north, slaveholding states being in the south. And at first, it was pretty easy to be. It was like the states that want slavery can have it. The states that don't want slavery don't have to have it. But then as you started adding states, each state had to decide whether it was going to be a slave state or a free state. So as we're going on, time is going on with this, you start having more and more conflict. And you come into an agreement that when it comes to these new states being added, that they create what they call the Mason-Dixon line, if you've ever heard of that. And so that was kind of an imaginary geographical line that divided the states into northern states and southern states. And the northern states would be free. Any new territory that became a state would be free. Any territory north of the Mason-Dixon line would be free. So as this conflict is going, you have more and more territories joining. Tensions are growing. The Whig Party ends. The Republican Party starts for the sole purpose of ending slavery. And it takes them a while. And their first president to get elected is Abraham Lincoln. And so now you still have Lincoln's letter. And on the basis of that letter, without any historical context, could look like that Lincoln's biggest concern is keeping the Union unified, and that's all he's going to war to do. But the question is, what is causing division in the Union? It's slavery. Lincoln came from the Republican Party, and the Republican Party's stated purpose was in slavery. So now, what I have here are another set of documents. I'm not going to read them in their entirety. I'm going to read selected parts. If you want to read them entirety, you can go to www.battlefields.org, the Declaration of Causes of Succeeding States. I'm going to look at 5. The first one I'm going to look at, and this one will take the longest, is Georgia. And Georgia paints a pretty good picture of what's going on. And Georgia's statement opens with, "The people of Georgia, having dissolved their political connection with the government of the United States of America, present to their Confederates and to the world the causes which have led to the separation. For the last 10 years, we have had numerous and serious causes of complaint against our non-slave holding Confederate states with reference to the subject of African slavery." And what they're talking about, this language will be throughout most of these letters. The Union, the Confederacy that they are talking about is the United States of America. And what ends up happening is you have a split where you have the northern states. I guess those probably during that war would have been called the United States of America, the federal states. And then you had the southern states, which were called the Confederate States. But in the context of these letters, the Confederate states refer to all the states that are members of the Union and don't really refer to the territories that the United States held at the time further west. And so we're going to skip down a little bit and continue. Notice the other thing, that the complaint is against the non-slave holding states with reference to the subject of African slavery. So they're making African slavery the subject of Georgia's statement of seceding from the Union. It continues later. The people of Georgia, after an equally full, fair, deliberate hearing of the case, have declared with equal firmness that they shall not rule over them. A brief history of the rise, progress, and policy of anti-slavery and the political organization into whose hands the administration of the federal government has been committed will fully justify the pronounced verdict of the people of Georgia. Now, this is why the Georgia's statement is so important in looking at this. They said They are going to lay out the history of the conflict. The party of Lincoln, called the Republican Party under its present name and organization, is of recent origin. It is admitted to be an anti-slavery party, while it attracts to itself by its creed the scattered advocates of exploded political heresies, of condemned theories in political economy, the advocates of commercial restrictions, of protection, of special privileges, of waste and corruption in the administration of government. Anti-slavery is its mission and its purpose. So the whole conflict, again stated, is anti-slavery of the northern states. By anti-slavery, it's made a power in the states. The question of slavery is great difficulty in the way of the formation of the Constitution. So in the Constitution, they decided not to abolish slavery. They did create a law that any person that was found in another state that was fleeing a different state to avoid what they called labor or working, and it was a way to refer to slavery. There were probably some other things like prison sentences, mandatory labor for prison sentences involved in that, but it also covered slavery. So they were complaining that the slaves that ran away weren't being returned. It says, while the subordination and the political and social inequality of the African race was fully conceded by all, it was plainly apparent that the slavery would soon disappear from what are now the non-slaveholding states of the original 13. The opposition to the slavery was then, as now, general in those states, and the Constitution was made with the direct reference to that fact. So they're admitting that the northern states, at least by the time of the Constitution, were all opposed to slavery as an institution. And Georgia is worried that those states are trying to end slavery, which Georgia sees as a right of the state of Georgia to have, and no other states have the right to tell Georgia not to do that. So we'll continue and step down some. They get into some of the history of it now. He says, we had acquired a large territory by successful war with Mexico. That's the Mexican-American War, where we got first the Texas territory and then became Texas and Oklahoma, part of Wyoming, small part of Wyoming, part of Colorado, and half of New Mexico. So that was the successful war with Mexico. Congress had to govern it. How, in relation to slavery, was the question then demanding the solution. The state of facts gave form and shape to the anti-slavery sentiment throughout the North, and the conflict began. So by adding those territories as states, the conflict begins. The Northern anti-slavery men of all parties asserted the right to exclude slavery from the territory by congressional legislation and demanded the prompt and efficient exercise of this power to that end. So the northern states are demanding that any states that gets added to the Union as a state has to be a free state. That's what the northern states want. And the southern states are objecting to that, in large because the southern agricultural economy relied heavily on slave labor. A little further on, it says, our rights were further fortified by the practice of the government from the beginning. Slavery was forbidden in the country northwest of Ohio River by what is called the Ordinance of 1787. That's the Mason-Dixon line. If you're north of that line, you're a free state. If you're south of that line, you're a slave state. And that was the rule. And any new territories that joined, if they were north of that line, that territory was going to become a free state. If they were south of that line, that territory was going to become a slave state. They continue on. In the 1820s, the North endeavored to overturn this wise and successful policy and demanded that the state of Missouri should not be admitted into the Union unless she first prohibited slavery within her limits by her Constitution. After a bitter and protracted struggle, the North was defeated in her special object, but her policy and position led to the adoption of a section in the law for the admission of Missouri, prohibiting slavery in all that portion of the territory acquired from France lying north of 36 degrees, 30 minutes northern latitude outside Missouri. Again, we're back to that Mason-Dixon line. The North demanded the application in principle of the prohibition of slavery to all the territory acquired from Mexico and all other parts of the public domain, and then in all future times. It says the reason was her fixed purpose to limit, restrain, and finally abolish slavery in the states where it existed. The South, with great unanimity, declared her purpose to resist the principle of prohibition to the last extremity. So the northern states want to end slavery. They want to abolish slavery, and the southern states are just having none of it. And they are going to protest down to the last power that they have. They continue on. Immediately after the result, the anti-slavery portion of the defended party resolved to unite all the elements in the North opposed to the slavery and to stake their future political fortunes upon their hostility to slavery everywhere. So, again, this is a gripe against the Republican Party of that time, that the Republican Party is staking everything on being able to end slavery. And the Republican Party didn't start this conflict. The Republican Party was kind of created to end the conflict, in a sense. And the conflict started shortly after probably the most notable anti-slave politician prior to kind of the 1850s, 1860s, where you get the Civil War, would have been, not Sam Adams. Sam Adams' brother, I'm forgetting his name right now. John Quincy Adams, actually Sam Adams' son. John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams had one term as president. Then he went to Congress. And in Congress, they had a law that you weren't supposed to mention slavery while Congress was in session during those different official meetings that Congress would have. And John Adams just was not having any of that. And he talked about slavery and ending slavery whenever and wherever he wanted to. So he kind of was the big person before you get to kind of the formation of the Republican Party. He was probably the biggest person pushing for the freedom of slavery. Here, Georgia continues further. The Constitution declares that persons charged with crimes in one state and fleeing to another shall be delivered upon the demand of the executive authority of the state from which they may flee, be tried in the jurisdiction where the crime was committed, and it would appear difficult to employ the language freer from ambiguity. And yet for above 20 years, the non-slaveholding states generally have wholly refused to deliver up persons charged with crimes affecting slave property. So this is referring to, I'll get a drink here. This is referring to runaway slaves. Slaves would run away, and abolitionist activists, anti-slavery activists, would help them escape into free states, and then the free states would simply refuse to return the people. And so this upset the southern states because the southern states saw these people as nothing more than property. And it even mentions that there's a provision in the Constitution requiring them to surrender fugitives from labor. And they continue, in the fourth year of the Republic, Congress passed a law to give full vigor and efficacy to the important provision. This act depended on a considerable degree upon the local magistrates in the several states for its efficacy. The non-slaveholding states generally repealed all laws intended to aid the execution of that act and imposed penalties upon those citizens whose loyalty to the Constitution and their oaths might induce them to discharge their duty. Their duty would be to find those runaway slaves and return them to their owners. So that's what we have from Georgia. Georgia's the longest one. But to make the point that this wasn't just a Georgia thing, that this was spread out, we're going to look at a couple of other states. The first one is Mississippi. And the state of Mississippi, has several short statements. It says, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. So they're saying, like, the world's economy isn't going to survive without slavery, according to Mississippi. They continue, its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of the commerce of the earth. These products are peculiar to the climate verging on the tropical regions, and by the imperious laws of nature, none but the black race can bear the exposure to the tropical sun. These products have become the necessities of the world, and a blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. So now this is Georgia, not me. The black people, the Africans, are the only people, according to Mississippi, the only people that can take that beating down sun and work all day. And by freeing these black slaves, the world's commerce would collapse. And throughout history, there'd been slavery throughout history. One of the issues of ancient slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, I would say was the worst form of slavery, but it definitely wasn't the only form of slavery. And I think it was probably the most organized form of slavery. So like during ancient times, the way you became a slave was you would go into debt. And so the person that owed you money would first take all your property and sell off your property. And then if that didn't happen, you would become his slave, and he would either just make you his slave and you would have to work for him the rest of your life, or he would sell you off and take the rest of whatever money that he could get for you on that current slave trade to whoever he sold you to. Or another way that you could become a slave was to be defeated in battle. So you could go from being a king to being a slave in the matter of a day because your army got defeated and you got captured. With the transatlantic slave trade, you had a whole system of slave that was coordinated with each other that involved whites first kidnapping Africans. It also involved Muslims and Arabs kidnapping Africans, and certain African tribes would kidnap people from other African tribes and then sell them to these slave traders. And then the slave traders would take them to different places, the United States being a major one of them, and would sell them to people that were wealthy and had money, and in their opinion were in need of a slave by their own view, and would sell them on that slave market wherever they were. And so Mississippi continues with a few more statements from Mississippi. It says, it has grown until it denies the right of property in slaves. So he's talking about these anti-slavery people, and refuse the protection to the right of the high seas, the territories, and whatever government the United States has jurisdiction. It refuses the admission of new slave states into the Union and seeks to extinguish it by confining it within its present limits, denying the power of expansion. So again, they're talking about the Civil War was about states' rights. The states' rights to what? The states' rights to have slavery. It says it has nullified fugitive slave law in almost every free state in the Union and has utterly broken the compact with our fathers pledged their faith to maintain. It advocates Negro equality, social and politically, and promotes the insurrection and incendiarism in our midst. So yeah, the stated purpose here of these anti-slave trades is equality between white people and black people. That was, at least that's the view of Mississippi. And it says it made combinations, formed associations to carry out its schemes of emancipation in the states and wherever else slavery exists. So Mississippi's problem was that the northern states were trying to restrict slavery, and the southern states wanted to have slavery as a right. South Carolina, let's take a look at South Carolina. Theirs is pretty long. Theirs, I'm not going to get into the other part, but if you go in and you read theirs, there's a lot of it that where they're not really mentioning slavery, but it really is leading up to slavery, because after you go through about 2 pages, you get to this paragraph. The Constitution of the United States, in its 4th article, provides as follows: no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from the service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. Now, this had several applications. One is, at that time, one of the sentences, if you were caught for certain crimes, could be forced labor. So if you were punished in a crime in one state and you were forced labor and you were out on a chain gang and you managed to get away and you ran into another state and the other state found you, that state was supposed to return you to the original state. But this also was applied to slaves. So if a slave ran away from a southern state, made it to the north to a free state, the southern states expected the free states to return that slave to its owner, his or her owner. And the northern states, by and large, weren't doing that. In fact, the slavery abolitionists, you may have heard of the Underground Railroad. They organized to try and smuggle slaves that were escaped out of the southern states into the northern states, sometimes all the way up into Canada. Continue on, but an increasing hostility on the part of the non-slaveholding states to the constitution of slavery has led to the disregard of their obligations and the laws, and the general government has ceased to affect the objects of the Constitution. So the complaint here is that they have violated the Constitution by not returning slaves to slave owners. They say the state of Ohio and Iowa have refused to surrender justice fugitives charged with murder and inciting servile insurrection in the state of Virginia. I'm not sure specifically what that, as far as specific instances. We do know that there was some violence between abolitionists and slaveholders. It could be referring to that. It could be referring directly to slaves. It could be referring to escaped criminals. I find that one least likely. Thus, the constituted compact has been deliberately broken and disregarded by the non-slaveholding states, and the consequence follows that South Carolina is released from her obligation. So South Carolina says, you violated this agreement, so we are not obliged to remain part of the Union. They continue on here. A geographical line has been drawn across the United States, and all states north of that have united in the election of a man of high office of the President of the United States, that would be Abraham Lincoln, whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. So whatever Abraham Lincoln was saying in that letter about slavery, everything else he was doing created an impression that he was hostile to slavery, including some of his own statements. He is entrusted with the administration of the common government because he had declared the government cannot endure permanently half slave, half free. And in that public, the mind must rest in the belief that slavery is in the course of ultimate extinction. So they are worried that by these statements, Lincoln saying that the country cannot survive being half slave, half free, that he's going to destroy slavery. And we have now Texas. And so here's Texas state of succession. She, referring to Texas, she was received as a commonwealth holding and maintaining protection in an institution known as Negro slavery, the servitude of the African to the white race within her limits, a relation that had existed from the first settlement of her wilderness by the white race, and which her people intended should exist in all future time. Slavery did come early on. The first people that came here, the people that came on the Mayflower, did not own slaves. But it wasn't that long after that that the first slave ship did reach American shores. The Declaration of Succession from Texas also states that these other states, the northern states, have deliberately, directly, or indirectly violated the third clause of the second section of the fourth article, the Fugitive Slave Clause of the federal Constitution, and the laws passed in the pursuance thereof, thereby annulling a material provision of the compact designed by its framers to perpetuate the amity between the members of the Confederacy and to secure the rights of the slaveholding states in their domestic institutions. A provision founded in justice and wisdom, and without the enforcement of which the compact fails to accomplish the objection of its creation. So that fourth article, the second section in the fourth article, was to protect slavery. That's Texas' position. Texas continues, all the non-slaveholding states in violation of that good faith and committee which should exist between entirely distinct nations, the people have formed themselves into a great sectional party, now strong enough in numbers to control the affairs of each of these states, based upon an unnatural feeling of hostility to these southern states and their beneficent patriarchal system of African slavery. So they're describing American slavery as beneficent. and it was not. Some have argued that um, some of the slaves benefited from slavery because they learned to trade, and then when slavery ended, they at least had a trade that they could go and make a living by. Now, it was true that um, some owners had their slaves learn and trade, and that afterwards, when those people became freedmen, they would go and work at that trade. Um, but that was not some sort of beneficent thing. The slave owner wasn't doing it out of love for the slave to get, so the slave could benefit for it. The slave owner was doing that because he wanted the slave to be able to um, build barns or sheds for food storage, or know how to change shoes on a horse, to shoe a horse, and maybe to make things out of leather. So they were learning those, but not. They weren't interested in the benefit of that to the slaves. They were interested in their own benefit from having a slave that could do that. They wouldn't have to go and pay a craftsman to do it because they had a slave that they could make do it for them. So they continue proclaiming the debasing doctrine of equality of all men, irrespective of race and color. The doctrine at war with nature, in opposition to the experience of mankind, and in violation of the plainest revelations of divine law. They demanded the abolition of Negro slavery throughout the Confederacy and the recognition of political equality between the white and the Negro races. Avow their determination to press on their crusade against us so long as the Negro slave remains in these states. For years past, this abolition organization has been actively sowing the seeds of discord throughout the Union and has rendered the federal Congress the arena for spreading firebrands and hatred between the slaveholding and non-slaveholding states. So what they're arguing here is they're arguing that it's natural for there to be slaves and that there's always been slavery, and they're arguing that basically that the white Europeans have always been superior to these black Africans, and so the whites were always superior to blacks. That's what the argument is here. Never mind that throughout history, most slave was not so much race-based slavery, which is what the transatlantic state was. Most slavery throughout the world in history was based on kind of the haves and the have-nots, the wealthy and the poorest, those who won a war and those who lost a war, those who went into debts and couldn't pay them, and those who those debts were owed to. Most slavery throughout the ancient world was based on that. Sometimes if you got caught, punishment for a crime would be to become a slave. So that was something that happened as well. Sometimes you were kidnapped by a raid on a village, and when you were kidnapped in that raid, you became a slave. But that happened between black tribes and black tribes. That happened between white Europeans and other white Europeans. That happened between Asians and other Asians, Middle Easterns and other Middle Easterns. And so there were at times mixed races, but it wasn't the mixed race that it was based on. That mixed race that it was based on is fairly unique to the transatlantic slave trade, to my understanding of the history of slavery. It continued, they have hired emissaries among us to burn our towns and distribute arms and poison to our slaves for the same purposes. Distribute arms and poison. So basically, they're mad that the North, that some of these abolitionists in the North supported slave rebellions in different ways. The North did go, I think, overboard on some of the things that they did in the Civil War, particularly General Sherman and the burning of Atlanta and some of the other cities like that. There were definitely things done, but that was two things. That was a different time, and it's warfare. Anytime you go into a war, both sides, even the side that's on the right, will become to some degree corrupted. War is sometimes necessary to stop evil, but if you go into a war as a soldier, you will come out different because you have killed somebody, and that changes you. And so, there were things like that went on. He says, they continue, they have refused to vote appropriations for protecting Texas against ruthless savages, talking about the Native Americans, for the sole reason that she is a slaveholding state. So apparently Texas's complaint is, we're being attacked by these Native Americans and we need help to defend our towns from raids from the Native Americans, and you won't help because we're a slaveholding state. They continue, and finally, by the combined sectional vote of the 17 non-slaveholding states, they have elected as president and vice president of the whole Confederacy two men whose chief claims as high position of their approval of these long-continued wrongs and their pledges to continue them and the final consummation of these schemes for the ruin of the slaveholding states. They're talking about Abraham Lincoln. They continue on. We hold as undeniable truths that the government of the various states of the Confederate itself were established exclusively by the white race for themselves and their posterity, that the African race had no agency in their establishment, that they were rightfully held and regarded as an inferior and dependent race, and that in condition only could their existence in this country be rendered beneficial or tolerable. So they're saying that the transatlantic trade slave is good for the African slave. That the African slave, if they weren't slaves, they would be, these dirty, ignorant, superstitious tribesmen down in nowhere in the middle of the Sahara or wherever. And that being a slave is actually lifting them up out of that. It seems to me that at best, going from that situation to being a slave is going from one bad situation to another bad situation, where best case scenario is you have forced labor, but at least you don't have a slave master that beats you, and you have a slave master that gives you good food, because a lot of slave masters would beat their slaves and would not make sure that they had enough food. A lot of times these slaves were underfed. He says that this government, all white men are, and of right, ought to be entitled to equal civil and political rights. The North wasn't disputing that. That the servitude of the African race, as existing in the states, is mutually beneficial to both free and abundantly authorized and justified by experience of mankind. the revealed will of the Almighty Creator. They're saying it's the will of God now. I might have to get into the slavery in the Bible. This is already going to be a long enough video, so I won't do it here. But in the Bible, when you're looking at slavery, you have to look at from the start, you have creation, you have Adam and Eve ruling over the garden. Their job is to take care of the earth, to spread the garden. You have a rebellion in the angelic realms. One of those angels comes down and tempts Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve get kicked out of the garden. Then you have this whole process of sinful humanity, and slavery comes about within sinful, fallen humanity. So slavery is a result of the fall in Christianity. And when you get to Revelation 21 and 22, what you have is humanity restored to its original status, where we are supposed to be kind of vice regents, local rulers underneath the supreme ruler of God. That was what Adam and Eve were supposed to do in the garden when they're tending the garden. They're taking care of the earth underneath the rulership, the headship of God. And we are restored to that. You see that picture in Revelation 21 and 22. So that whole section of the Bible gets ignored by arguments like this, that slavery itself, according to the Bible, is a result of the fall of man. You don't have slavery before the fall of man. It says, as recognized by all Christian nations, Christians had a mixed history when it comes to slavery. The earliest Christians, before Constantine, were not advocates of slavery. Some of them had slaves, especially the wealthy Christians had slaves, but for the most part, they were not like really big slaveholders. Paul's letter in Philemon, while it doesn't explicitly, Paul doesn't explicitly disavow slavery as an institution, what he's telling a slave owner to treat his slave as an equal, not as someone that is inferior to him and just subject to whatever whim he wants. He's to and treat that slave as an equal, and with all due respect that an equal would get. So that kind of sets in motion, like in the historical terms, takes time to develop, but that kind of sets in motion this whole theological thinking about slavery that leads to the abolition of slavery. Both in England, which was headed up by Christians, William Wilberforce having written a book on Christian doctrine that he said he needed to write before he thought that he could end slavery. So, the abolitionists in England were Christians. And by the time that this is written, slavery has been gone in England for approximately 40 years or so. So he says, the destruction of the existing relations between the two races, an advocate by our sectional enemies, would bring inevitable calamities upon both and desolation upon the 15 slaveholding states. History shows that it did not. Now, some of these people that are advocating for slavery right now, that are talking about the southern states, were right. They're looking at the current inflation that started kind of with COVID, and then there's a lot of factors governing it. I don't think our country has responded well to them, but that's a different discussion. But they're looking at our current states of inflation, our current kind of hectic economy, the rise in the cost of food, and they are basically saying if the South had won, none of this would happen. And so what we need to do is go back to the ideas of Confederacy, and that would include reinstating race-based slavery. It says, by the succession of 6 of the slaveholding states and the certainty that others will speedily do likewise, Texas has no alternative, but to remain in an isolated connection with the North or united in her destinies with the South. So they're looking at either they go with the North or the South, which was the choice of the states at the time. The way things were, there weren't really going to be any halfway sitters. Oddly enough, Virginia is the only slave state that does not mention slavery. Yeah, they just say that they've, is it? Oh, no, they do. They says, here's the only mention in it. It says, the people of Virginia, in the ratification of the Constitution of the United States of America, adopted by them the Convention of the 25th day of June, in the year of our Lord 1788, having declared that the powers granted under said Constitution were derived from the people of the United States and might be resumed whenever the same should be perverted to their injury and oppression, the federal government having perverted said powers, not only injured the peoples of Virginia, but the oppression of the southern slaveholding states. So it's oppression of the slaveholding states. So it's not explicitly slavery, but it is definitely oppression of the slaveholding states in their view, which peripherally is a defense of slavery, just not a direct offense. So there you have it. Even though they used that first letter by Lincoln to try and say, no, it wasn't, the Civil War wasn't about slavery, it was about keeping the states from succeeding. They never get to the issue of why the states were succeeding. And they point to Lincoln's statements that if he could keep the Union together without freeing any of the slaves, he would do it. It's really an odd statement by Lincoln when you consider the whole historical context of the situation there, and when you consider what he did. Lincoln ran for the Republicans. The Republicans were founded a single issue party, and that single issue was the abolition of slavery. So that was back in the 1860s. But that was their foundation. And I think when you take seriously why the states say they're seceding from the Union, all of the states say the reason for their secession from the Union is that the northern states want an institution of slavery. So I wanted to take so much by reading these documents firsthand, because these are primary historical sources, and the primary historical sources show that what the Civil War was about the institution of slavery, and anything else that was at issue was secondary to the institution of slavery. I hope you have enjoyed this video. I hope that maybe it's clarified some things for you. Please leave your comments down in the chat. I will get to all of your comments eventually if I don't do it right away. And I thank you for watching this video, and I will see you next time.